So I don't know exactly why it is, but I keep finding myself interested by industry topics. And what's been on my mind lately is the relationship that parent companies have with their subsidiary companies. And in the specific context of this video, I'm talking about Microsoft's relationship with World of Warcraft and Square Enix's relationship with Final Fantasy. And what's so interesting about these two titans of MMOs is that the relationships they've had with their parent companies kind of worked in reverse. And what I mean by that is for World of Warcraft, you had Blizzard, which started as an indie game company, which then got acquired by the whale that was Activision in 2008, which then got acquired by the behemoth that is Microsoft earlier this year. Whereas with Final Fantasy XIV, you had Square Enix, and that was already the behemoth, and then the MMO kind of sprung forth from the behemoth. And so I'm going to be talking about these two games. I'm going to start with World of Warcraft, good and bad, and then Final Fantasy, good and bad. If you don't care about WoW and you want to skip to Final Fantasy, I'll have the timestamps and we'll begin. So, with World of Warcraft, the bad thing about WoW being acquired twice now by bigger corporations really just fundamentally comes down to the nature of products and what happens to products as companies grow. And so Steve Jobs has this interview, I'll link it in the description, where he talks about his relationship with John Scully. John Scully was an executive for PepsiCo, and PepsiCo is the company that makes Pepsi. And Steve Jobs was saying that if you're PepsiCo, your product is pretty stagnant. It's staying the same. You have Pepsi, and every 10 years they change up the product. And by change up the product, that means getting a different sized bottle, right? And so the people that drive companies like PepsiCo are going to be sales and marketing people because the product is pretty stagnant and static. And so you don't really need product people to continuously innovate or service customers. I mean, you just deliver them the Pepsi. And so it's really the sales and marketing people who end up being the decision makers who end up being in the positions of power. And then Steve Jobs says what can happen is that can get transferred over to technology companies. And he says what happens with technology companies is you usually have a small team of people or an innovator or someone who, or a group of people who have love in their hearts for technology. They have love in their hearts for a problem they want to solve and people they want to serve. And they have craftsmanship and they have artisanship and they want to make quality and they're concerned about quality. And so then what ends up happening, Steve Jobs says, is that once those people, the innovators, the craftsmen, the artists have made the product that is good and that people like, it then needs to get distributed. And who distributes products? Who gets products known? Who gets them bought and sold? It's the marketers and the salespeople. And so then the marketing and the salespeople then come in to grow these companies. And then Steve Jobs goes ahead and says the problem with this happening is these aren't people who were artisans or craftsmen or people who had love in their hearts, his words, for the product. And now listen, all my adult life so far, I've had marketing roles and sales roles. Okay? So if you're a marketing or a salesperson, don't add me, okay? I'm right there with you. Just don't take it personally. This is what Steve Jobs said. And he says when these people then get into these positions, they don't really, understand what a quality product is. And the way they're thinking is, well, if we change the quality, how is that going to improve sales? They're like, no, advertising is what improves sales. And so they're going to be worried and think about advertising. And so then these people then take up the positions of power. And then what ends up happening is the quality of the product degenerates. Now, Kevin Jordan, one of the original game designers on Vanilla World of Warcraft, the guy I bring up a lot in my videos, and the reason why I bring him up a lot in my videos is because I'm a huge fan of the guy. He explicitly tells the story of being at Blizzard when it was a small indie company, and he said that it was this small group of people, and they were all gamers, they were all nerds, and they all really just wanted to make the game that they themselves wanted to play. And, their culture was very casual, and they would sleep at the office, and they'd have a lot of fun. And ultimately, these were people who were the product people, the craftsmen, the artisans. And so, out of this company, out of this little indie game company, came World of Warcraft. And World of Warcraft got really successful really quickly. And because it got so successful so quickly, they needed more people to join Blizzard very quickly in order to keep the service for that product going, as well as, handle the load and continuously continue to run the company. And so Kevin said that the interview process at Blizzard was initially very rigorous, and they would vet people out very meticulously. But because WoW became so successful and they needed a lot more people a lot faster, they didn't really have as much time to go through as much of a rigorous of a process and onboard people, as meticulously. And so they needed more and more people quickly. And so they kind of just needed more hands, and they just hired people a lot quicker. And he says what that ended up doing was, when Blizzard was still young, the people who would join and who would want to join, and their intentions would be to join a company that makes great games, and they wanted to make great games because there was no guarantee of success. Blizzard hadn't attained a huge financial success just yet. And so there was no guarantee that they were going to cash out. There was no guarantee that they were going to become rich. The only guarantee was you join a company of guys who are about as passionate as you are, and maybe you'll make a great game one day. And they did. And because World of Warcraft was then so successful, it attracted people who wanted a bit of that success. They saw that success that World of Warcraft had, and they said, I want a piece of that. Let me get in on that. And so whereas the incentive was initially about the product, it then became about the money for the new wave of people coming in after the success of the company. And this is coming from Kevin Jordan. He said this himself. Okay, so if you look at a company like Amazon Game Studio as well, you have New World, which wasn't really a huge success. It had its problems. And you have Lost Ark, which is a very pay-to-win game. My point is, the bigger the company gets, the more there's incentive to operate as a money-making machine, and the less there's an incentive of making beautiful, high-quality things. And that's the big downside for World of Warcraft getting acquired, not once, but twice. Now, is it all doom and gloom? No, it's not. And the reason why it's not really comes down to two things. Being acquired by Microsoft means that there is less pressure on World of Warcraft to make profits quarter by quarter. Because when you're short-term looking for profits quarter by quarter, you need to monetize hard. You need to sell mounts with 6-month subs. You need WoW tokens. You need all this stuff so you could please your shareholders, because your shareholders need WoW to do good for their stocks to go up. But Microsoft is fucking gigantic. Not only do they have a lot more game titles, Call of Duty now, and Crash Bandicoot, and Halo, and Minecraft, they also have a lot of things outside of gaming too. And so the pressure on World of Warcraft to perform for Microsoft's stock is a lot smaller than it was for Activision. Now, I know that World of Warcraft wasn't the only Activision Blizzard game, but it was definitely a much bigger portion of that stock profile than is right now for Microsoft. And so there's less pressure, which means that they might be able to then be more patient with their monetization and not push it so aggressively, and instead rely on goodwill like they once used to. Now, that's the first thing. The second thing about it is now, of course, they have more funding. And because they have more funding from Microsoft, that could also make them feel like they have more room to breathe. They don't have to monetize as heavily, and their jobs aren't as much at risk, and they could spend time making quality instead of focusing on just cashing out. Because the faster you focus on cashing out, the worse that you're going to have to monetize, and the less time you have to worry about the quality of the product. So that's really the bright side. Now, what's interesting about Final Fantasy, and we're going to get into Final Fantasy now, is Square Enix existed first, and then Final Fantasy XIV then came to exist under a big corporate entity that existed already. And what ended up happening was the big corporate entity couldn't figure it the fuck out. So they made Final Fantasy 1.0, which was a fucking disaster. Nobody liked it. It had very poor reviews. and they needed to save the game. And so then what did they do? They brought in the artisan, they brought in the product guy, they brought in Yoshi P, who's been playing MMOs like a fiend his whole entire life, who would buy 4 different internet packages at a time. So in case one went down, he could swap to another internet service provider. This is how serious the guy was. The dude played a lot of freaking video games. He was a huge Blizzard fan too. And so the big corporation then brings in the product person, the artisan, the craftsman. And the reason why they do it, of course, is for profit. But because they failed trying to do it on their own, they brought in this guy, Yoshi P, right? The game director of Final Fantasy XIV. And then he brought the game to success. Now, the downside of Final Fantasy XIV being owned. I mean, okay, so the bright side, of course, is there would be no Final Fantasy 2.0. There would be no Realm Reborn if it wasn't for Square Enix having the money to support a whole ass failure of an MMO and then to support a complete redoing and a revamping of it from scratch to allow for Final Fantasy 2.0 and a Realm Reborn. If you didn't have a big company with that much money to back it up, Final Fantasy 1.0 would have failed and that would have been the end of it. So that's, a good thing that happened with Final Fantasy. Now, my issue and my concern with Final Fantasy in this regard is the whole NFT situation, okay? So the president of Square Enix came out in January and he said that he's a huge fan of NFTs and that there's a category of gamers who play for fun, but that he could create a category that plays to earn, blah, 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 okay? We all probably know this. If you're watching this video, you probably already know this happened. And then more recently, Yoshida, or Yoshi P, the game director of Final Fantasy, came out and he said, we're not going to put NFTs into the game. Don't worry, relax. But he did say that he was open to the potential and he was open to the technology. And if the opportunity presented itself for him to implement NFTs into the game in a way that made sense, he would do it. This is what Yoshida said. And maybe I'm being a pessimist here, but I feel like that means that I don't have full control over the situation. And they may try to force me to do it, and I'll try to make it not happen. But if I'm forced to, I'm forced to. Now, how much creative control does he have? I think he has a lot because he took a game that was a huge failure and made it a huge success. So I think if Yoshida tells the president, hey, yo, I actually don't think that I want to put these in the game, does he have influence over the CEO of Square Enix? Probably, because he's made the game fairly successful so far. So hopefully that doesn't happen. But there's always that potential that it gets forced down his throat. And that's about it for this video. This has been Glavian, and we'll see you in the next one. Peace.